In today's video, we dive deep into one of the most controversial and longest-serving leaders in Africa, Uganda's President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. For nearly 4 decades, Museveni has shaped Uganda's political, social, and economic direction in ways that have inspired admiration from some and intense resentment from others. Many Ugandans praise him for bringing stability after years of civil war, while others accuse him of overstaying in power, suppressing opposition, and tightening control over the country's political space. So why do some Ugandans say they hate President Museveni so much, and why do others go as far as calling him a dictator? To answer these questions, we must go back in time, to his childhood, his early influences, his armed struggles, and the long path that eventually led him to the presidency. Then, we explore his governance, his achievements, his failures, and the controversies that continue to define his legacy. When Museveni returned to Uganda after his studies in Dar es Salaam, he walked into a political landscape that was already cracking from within. The excitement of independence had faded, and Uganda was slowly drifting into political tribalism, corruption, and mistrust among leaders. Museveni's early involvement in government, first through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and later in intelligence work, exposed him to the true inner workings of the state. He saw how decisions were often made based on ethnic alliances instead of national interest, and how political leaders used the military as their personal tool for survival rather than a national institution. These experiences convinced him that Uganda's political system needed radical change. Change he believed could only come from disciplined, ideologically grounded leadership. While working in government, Museveni quietly began building connections with young intellectuals and university graduates who shared his idealistic views. He encouraged them to study liberation struggles across Africa and explore strategies of guerrilla warfare, believing that Uganda was heading toward crisis. And in 1971, the crisis arrived. General Idi Amin, in a sudden military coup, overthrew Milton Obote. Uganda was instantly thrown into a new era, one that Museveni had predicted would bring violence and fear. Amin's government quickly became notorious for brutality. Thousands disappeared, political opponents were hunted, and state institutions collapsed under the weight of intimidation. Museveni, now seen as a potential threat due to his political activism and revolutionary ideas, fled into exile in Tanzania. Exile became the turning point of his career. In Tanzania, Museveni found protection under President Julius Nyerere, a leader who supported liberation movements across Africa. Museveni used his time there to begin forming a small but determined rebel group known as the Front for National Salvation, or FRNASA. Although FRNASA was tiny compared to other Ugandan factions, it attracted young, ideologically driven fighters from Uganda and neighboring countries. They trained in guerrilla tactics, political ideology, and revolutionary discipline skills that would later become crucial in Museveni's rise to power. Tanzania became the training ground where Museveni transformed from an intellectual with revolutionary ideas into a practical guerrilla organizer prepared for armed resistance. In 1978, when Idi Amin made the mistake of invading Tanzania, Nyerere launched a counterattack aimed at removing him entirely. Museveni and his FRNASA fighters joined this war, helping Tanzanian forces push Amin out of Uganda. Even though Museveni's group was small compared to other anti-Amin forces, his involvement earned him growing respect and positioned him as a rising figure in Uganda's liberation politics. After Amin fell in 1979, a transitional government took over, and Museveni was appointed Minister of Defense. This was his first major government role, but it was short-lived due to internal political wrangles and competing factions all fighting for influence in the new Uganda. The situation worsened in 1980 when the country held elections meant to restore democracy. Many Ugandans believed the elections were rigged in favor of Milton Obote, who returned to power despite widespread accusations of manipulation. For Museveni, this was the final proof that Uganda's political elite had no intention of allowing genuine democracy. He publicly rejected the election results and declared that the government had stolen the will of the people. With this, he made the decisive and historic move to return to armed struggle. In February 1981, with only about 27 fighters and a handful of rifles, Museveni launched a guerrilla rebellion in the Luro Triangle, marking the birth of the National Resistance Army (NRA). These early days were difficult, poorly equipped, lacking resources, and constantly pursued by government forces, but Museveni's disciplined ideological approach kept the group alive. The seeds of what would later become his long presidency had been planted in this moment. A determined guerrilla leader heading into the bush with a small band of fighters, convinced that only the gun could restore justice and stability in Uganda. And as the conflict grew, the NRA expanded, built alliances, and slowly evolved from a tiny rebel unit into a powerful revolutionary force that would challenge the entire Ugandan state. When Museveni and his small band of fighters retreated into the Luro Triangle in 1981, few people believed that this tiny group could challenge an entire national army. They were outnumbered, poorly armed, and constantly hunted by government forces loyal to Milton Obote. Yet the determination and discipline Museveni had cultivated for years became the guiding force that kept the rebellion alive. The early months in the bush were harsh. The NRA fighters operated with almost no supplies. They relied on local villagers for food, shelter, and information. Many of these villagers paid a heavy price for supporting the rebels, as government troops often carried out brutal reprisals, destroying villages suspected of aiding Museveni's forces. It was a dark and painful period, and the Luro region soon became one of the most traumatized landscapes in Uganda's modern history. As the rebellion grew, Museveni emphasized not just military strategy but also ideology. He created strict rules for his soldiers. They were not allowed to loot, harass civilians, or abuse local communities. He believed that the only way to win a guerrilla war was by earning the trust of the population. This approach slowly gained him local support, allowing the NRA to move, regroup, and train without being exposed. Museveni's fighters also adopted classic guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, sabotage operations, and nighttime movements that confused government troops. Over time, these tactics weakened the National Army's confidence and strengthened the rebel movement's morale. By 1983, the conflict had escalated. Government forces launched massive operations to crush the rebellion, leading to widespread displacement and suffering among civilians. The violence only deepened resentment toward the Obote government. Museveni's fighters, surviving through mobility and discipline, began capturing weapons and pushing back. More young people joined the NRA, either out of ideological belief or pure desperation. What had started as a small rebel group slowly grew into a structured army with ranks, specialized units, and a political wing known as the National Resistance Movement, NRM. This political wing was responsible for spreading Museveni's message that Uganda needed a new political order free from tribalism, corruption, and electoral manipulation. The war continued even after Obote was overthrown in a 1985 coup by his own generals. Although the new military rulers tried to negotiate with Museveni, the talks collapsed due to mistrust and disagreements over power sharing. Museveni, now confident that the NRA had enough strength to win outright, decided to intensify the struggle. The NRA marched toward Kampala, capturing territory, recruiting more fighters, and gaining momentum with every victory. In January 1986, after 5 long years of bush warfare, the NRA entered the capital city. The government forces retreated, and Museveni declared victory. He was sworn in as Uganda's new president with a bold promise that the era of coups, dictatorships, and rigged elections was over. Museveni's arrival in power was celebrated by many Ugandans who were exhausted by decades of instability. He presented himself as a new kind of African leader, young, charismatic, ideological, and committed to rebuilding the nation. His trademark beret, military fatigues, and calm but firm speeches symbolized a leader who had fought his way to the top and believed passionately in transforming Uganda. Yet beneath the excitement of a new beginning, the seeds of future controversies were already planted. Museveni's belief in revolutionary democracy, his reliance on military structures, and his suspicion of multi-party competition would later become central to the criticisms against him. But in 1986, those tensions were still far in the future. For the moment, Museveni was the liberator who had ended years of chaos and promised a new dawn for Uganda. When Museveni took power in 1986, Uganda was a country tired of war, coups, and political uncertainty. Entire regions were devastated. The economy had collapsed, and many Ugandans were simply relieved to see a leader who promised stability and national unity. Museveni entered Kampala not just as a president, but as a symbol of hope, a young revolutionary who spoke confidently about democracy, security, and rebuilding a nation that had been torn apart for nearly 2 decades. He declared that the NRA was not a conquering army, but a people's force, and that his government would focus on healing the country's wounds. In the early years, Museveni worked hard to project himself as a reformer. He formed a broad-based government that included various political groups, civil society members, and even some of his former rivals. This inclusivity earned him praise both inside and outside Uganda. The economy, which had been suffocated by years of mismanagement, began to recover as Museveni welcomed foreign investment and worked closely with the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Roads were repaired, schools reopened, public services revived, and national institutions slowly regained credibility. Many Ugandans felt a sense of normalcy for the first time in decades. Museveni also introduced a unique political system called the movement system, which he said was designed to end divisive multi-party politics. Under this model, political parties technically existed, but they were not allowed to campaign or compete openly for power. Museveni argued that Uganda's history had shown that parties fueled tribal divisions, so the movement system was meant to unite the country under a common national identity. Critics, however, later claimed that this system was a clever way of entrenching his own power by preventing serious political competition. But in the early years, many Ugandans accepted it because they valued peace more than anything else. Security became another cornerstone of Museveni's early rule. He focused heavily on professionalizing the military, introducing discipline and reducing the chaos that had characterized Uganda's armed forces in previous regimes. He launched campaigns to restore order in northern and eastern regions, though these efforts eventually led to conflicts with rebel groups, including the notorious Lord's Resistance Army, led by Joseph Kony. While the government claimed it was working to protect civilians, many communities in the north later accused the army of abuses, laying the foundation for long-term resentment that still exists today. At the same time, Museveni began positioning himself as a regional statesman. He was active in peace negotiations in neighboring countries, such as Rwanda, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. His willingness to intervene in regional conflicts earned him international respect, especially from Western countries that saw him as a strong, reliable partner in a turbulent region. Uganda became a key ally in international peacekeeping missions, and Museveni gained a reputation as a leader who could be counted on to maintain stability in East Africa. Back at home, however, the seeds of future political tension began to grow. While Museveni initially promised to lead Uganda toward a functioning multi-party democracy, he repeatedly postponed reforms, saying the country still needed time to rebuild. His government became increasingly dependent on the military, and some of his former comrades began accusing him of centralizing power. Corruption started creeping into government institutions, and high-ranking officials connected to the ruling movement were often shielded from accountability. These developments worried many Ugandans who had believed Museveni would be different from the past leaders who abused their positions. Despite these concerns, Museveni continued to enjoy strong support throughout the 1990s due to the relative stability and economic progress the country experienced under his leadership. For many people, the improvements in security and daily life were enough to justify his continued rule. But as he grew more comfortable in power, Uganda slowly moved away from the revolutionary principles he had once spoken passionately about in the bush. His government began showing signs of the same authoritarian traits he had vowed to end. What started as a hopeful new chapter for Uganda gradually transformed into a political landscape that would later fuel disappointment, anger, and eventually, widespread criticism of a leader who had once been celebrated as a national liberator. As the 1990s came to an end, the spirit of optimism that had carried Museveni into power slowly began to collide with the realities of long-term leadership. Many Ugandans expected that after stabilizing the country and rebuilding national institutions, Museveni would guide Uganda into a fully democratic era and eventually hand over power to a new generation. Instead, his actions signaled something different. A steady consolidation of authority that suggested he had no intention of leaving anytime soon. The first major turning point came in 2005, when Uganda's parliament voted to remove presidential term limits. This was a deeply controversial decision because term limits had been written into the 1995 constitution specifically to prevent leaders from clinging to power indefinitely. For many people, lifting these limits felt like a betrayal of the very principles Museveni had promised during the Bush War. Principles that had convinced Ugandans he was different from past strongmen. Behind the scenes, allegations spread that the government had influenced the vote through political pressure and financial inducements. Although the government denied these claims, the public perception was clear. Museveni was preparing himself for a much longer stay in power. Many Ugandans who had once admired him began to question whether he still viewed himself as a revolutionary leader serving the nation, or a politician determined to maintain control at all costs. And yet, despite growing dissatisfaction, Museveni remained popular in many rural areas where development programs and government support continued to win him loyalty. This divide between urban criticism and rural support became one of the defining features of Ugandan politics. As elections continued under the multi-party system, which had been restored in 2005, opposition parties began to grow stronger. However, these parties often faced significant challenges. Opposition leaders were frequently arrested during campaigns, rallies were disrupted, and media houses critical of the government complained of intimidation. The state's heavy security presence at political events created the impression that Uganda was drifting toward a controlled political environment rather than an open democracy. For some Ugandans, this signaled the beginning of what they openly described as authoritarian rule. For others, it was seen as a necessary measure to maintain order and prevent the country from falling back into chaos. Museveni's long rule also brought to light internal divisions within the military and government. Some of his former Bush War comrades began voicing concerns that the revolutionary ideals they had fought for were being abandoned. They accused Museveni of centralizing power around himself and his close allies, especially within the security sector. Over time, many of these early comrades were sidelined, retired, or weakened politically. Their departure from the inner circle strengthened Museveni's control but deepened the perception that he was no longer open to sharing authority. Meanwhile, accusations of corruption within high-ranking government circles increased. Large infrastructure projects, procurement deals, and public funds were frequently involved in scandals that frustrated ordinary citizens who felt the benefits of government programs were not reaching them. Another point of rising tension was the role of the military in national affairs. Museveni increasingly relied on the army and security agencies not only for external defense but also for handling internal political situations. Heavy deployments during elections, protests, or opposition activities made many Ugandans feel that political power was being protected by force rather than public trust. Younger generations who had not lived through the chaos of the 1970s and 1980s saw this as unnecessary militarization, and it fueled resentment, especially among youth in urban areas. By the mid-2010s, Uganda had become a country where Museveni's supporters praised him for stability, infrastructure development, and economic progress, while his critics accused him of entrenching himself in power through constitutional changes, military dominance, and suppression of dissent. The removal of the presidential age limit in 2017 only intensified these criticisms. This amendment cleared the path for Museveni to run for president beyond the age of 75, confirming to many that he intended to rule indefinitely. Protests erupted, and clashes between security forces and civilians became more frequent. Videos of violent arrests and crackdowns spread across social media, shaping the image of a government losing connection with its younger population. Museveni's critics argued that he had transformed from a liberator into the very kind of long-serving ruler he once condemned, while his supporters insisted that he remained the only leader capable of keeping Uganda stable in a region prone to conflict. This sharp division in public opinion laid the foundation for the growing anger, frustration, and disillusionment that would later explode in later years, especially as new opposition movements emerged and as the country's youth, who had never known any president other than Museveni, began demanding change more loudly than ever before. As Museveni's rule stretched into its third decade, the country's population began to transform in ways that would dramatically reshape Uganda's political atmosphere. A new generation was rising, young people born long after the Bush War, long after Amin, and long after Obote. These youths had grown up in an era of relative stability, but they faced new frustrations. Unemployment, corruption, limited opportunities, and a political system dominated by the same figure who had been in power since before many of them were born. This generational gap created a powerful shift. While older Ugandans remembered the chaos of the past and valued Museveni's role in bringing peace, the younger population felt disconnected from those memories and instead focused on the problems they saw around them every day. For them, Museveni's long rule felt less like a guarantee of stability and more like a barrier to progress. This tension grew steadily until it found a powerful symbol in Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, better known as Bobi Wine. A popular musician and outspoken social figure, Bobi Wine captured the frustrations and aspirations of Uganda's youth in a way no opposition politician had done before. He spoke their language, lived their struggles, and used music as a tool for political expression. When he entered parliament in 2017, he didn't just win a seat. He electrified an entire generation. His message was simple but powerful: that Uganda belonged to its young people, and that leadership should be open to change, not controlled by a single individual forever. His rise challenged Museveni in a way the president had not experienced since taking power. The government quickly recognized the threat posed by this new wave of youthful activism. Bobi Wine's rallies drew massive crowds, his songs became anthems of resistance, and his message spread across social media platforms where the majority of Uganda's youth spent their time. In response, security forces often blocked his events, arrested him and his supporters, and accused him of inciting unrest. Each crackdown, however, only strengthened his image as a victim of state repression and fueled more anger among young people who already felt ignored by those in power. The clashes between youth protesters and security agencies became more frequent and more intense, painting a picture of a country growing increasingly polarized. The 2021 election cycle became the peak of this conflict. Bobi Wine announced his presidential bid, and what followed was one of the most tense and violent campaign seasons in Uganda's recent history. His rallies were repeatedly dispersed, his team members arrested, and his movements restricted. At times, he was forcibly blocked from radio appearances or campaign areas, creating viral images that spread across the world. In November 2020, when he was arrested during campaigning, widespread protests erupted across Kampala and other cities. The response was swift and severe. Security forces used live bullets, tear gas, and heavy force to quell the demonstrations. Dozens of people died, hundreds were injured, and many more were detained. The government argued that the protests had become violent and required strong action, but for many Ugandans, especially those watching the scenes unfold on social media, it was further proof that the state was using excessive force to silence dissent. These events hardened public opinion. Even some Ugandans who had previously been neutral or supportive of Museveni began questioning the direction the country was taking. The images of youth being beaten, arrested, or killed deepened resentment and created a sense of generational betrayal. For many young people, the government's actions became a symbol of how disconnected the leadership had become from the realities faced by ordinary citizens. At the same time, Museveni dismissed the protests as orchestrated chaos and insisted that Uganda would not be allowed to fall into instability again. He portrayed himself as the defender of national security against what he described as foreign-backed attempts to disrupt the country. After the 2021 election, an election marked by internet shutdowns, heavy military presence, and widespread allegations of irregularities, Museveni was declared winner once again. Bobi Wine rejected the results, and his supporters claimed the election had been neither free nor fair. For many Ugandans, this moment became the clearest symbol of a political system that no longer reflected their will. Museveni's critics said he had transitioned fully into the role of an authoritarian ruler, using state machinery to maintain power rather than relying on genuine public support. Meanwhile, his loyalists argued that he had protected the country from chaos and ensured that Uganda would not slide into the violence that had characterized so much of its past. This clash of narratives, between supporters who see him as a stabilizing father figure and critics who view him as an aging authoritarian unwilling to let go, continued to shape the country. But one thing had become undeniable: the youth no longer feared challenging the system. Their voices grew louder, their frustration deeper, and their determination stronger. Museveni still held power, but the relationship between the state and its youngest citizens had changed dramatically. What had begun decades earlier as admiration for a liberator had, for many in the new generation, transformed into resentment toward a leader they felt had overstayed and lost touch with the people he once promised to serve. As the years went on, something began to shift in the hearts of many Ugandans. People who once spoke of Museveni with pride and admiration slowly began to express frustration, disappointment, and in some cases outright anger. It was not a sudden change, but a gradual buildup. A feeling that the country was stuck under a leader who no longer seemed to represent the dreams he once inspired. This period is often described by Ugandans as the beginning of Museveni fatigue, a collective sense of exhaustion toward a presidency that felt endless. Uganda's young population played an especially important role in this shift. With the country's average age below 20, many young people grew up knowing only one president. To them, Museveni was not the liberator their parents spoke about. He was simply the man who had always been in power, the only leader they had ever known. And over time, they began to feel that the country was not creating enough opportunities for them. Youth unemployment remained high, university graduates struggled to find stable work, and the cost of living continued to rise while wages stayed low. The disconnect between the leadership and the youth became more and more visible. At the same time, political tension rose each time Uganda approached an election year. The opposition repeatedly accused the government of tightening its grip on power, limiting political space, and using state institutions to maintain control. High-profile arrests, clashes between security forces and opposition supporters, and restrictions on public rallies created a sense of fear and aggression that many Ugandans felt was unnecessary in a peaceful democracy. These events slowly chipped away at the image of a leader who once promised freedom and stability. Economic frustrations also began to take a toll on public opinion. Although Uganda continued to attract foreign investment and show pockets of growth, many ordinary citizens felt left behind. Rising taxes, increasing fuel prices, and reports of corruption within government institutions caused people to question whether the country's resources were truly benefiting everyone. Allegations of mismanagement of funds meant for public services, such as healthcare, education, and roads, deepened the belief that the system was serving a few rather than the many. For communities outside Kampala, the frustrations were even more personal. Some felt that development was uneven, with certain regions receiving more attention than others. Farmers complained about fluctuating crop prices, limited market access, and poor infrastructure that made it hard to transport goods. As these concerns piled up, many Ugandans felt their voices were not being heard by the leadership they once believed in. In the world of social media, which became a powerful force in Uganda, criticism of the government spread faster than ever before. Young creators, musicians, and activists openly discussed issues like inequality, corruption, and human rights concerns. Hashtags and online campaigns emerged, capturing the frustrations of a generation that demanded change. Each viral post intensified the debate about Museveni's long stay in power. By this point, the idea that Museveni had overstayed his welcome became a common topic in everyday conversations. For many, it was not just about economic challenges or political controversies. It was the belief that no leader should stay in power for decades. People felt the country needed fresh ideas, new energy, and leadership that understood the struggles of modern Uganda. Others remained loyal to Museveni, arguing that he had kept the country stable for years. But even among supporters, the question became louder. How much longer should one man lead a nation? This era marked a turning point in Uganda's relationship with its president. The admiration of the early years had faded into division, with strong supporters on one side and deeply frustrated citizens on the other. And as Museveni stayed in power year after year, the feeling of Museveni fatigue grew, setting the stage for one of the most emotional and debated periods in Uganda's political story. As Museveni's presidency entered its fourth decade, Uganda's political landscape became increasingly polarized. What had once been widespread admiration and hope slowly gave way to frustration, mistrust, and resentment, particularly among younger Ugandans who had grown up knowing only one president. The rise of social media and instant communication amplified these sentiments, as images, videos, and first-hand accounts of corruption, repression, and inequality spread rapidly, creating a shared narrative of discontent. The younger generation no longer relied solely on traditional media. They were now connected to a wider world where they could compare Uganda with other countries, and in doing so, they increasingly questioned why so many opportunities and freedoms seemed blocked. During this period, Museveni's government continued to showcase development projects, roads, hydroelectric dams, and infrastructure initiatives, and these achievements earned him praise among some sections of the population. Rural communities, which often benefited from targeted government programs, remained loyal, believing that Museveni's presence ensured continuity and security. But in urban areas, where education and exposure to global trends were higher, criticism grew louder. People began pointing out glaring inconsistencies. Promises of economic prosperity contrasted sharply with widespread poverty, limited employment opportunities, and unequal access to basic services. The narrative of a leader who brought stability began to clash with the narrative of a government increasingly distant from the daily struggles of ordinary citizens. Political opposition, once fragmented and marginalized, also began to gain momentum. Figures like Bobi Wine became symbols of a generational revolt against what many perceived as an entrenched, authoritarian regime. Even moderate critics within the political establishment felt constrained, knowing that challenging Museveni often invited arrest, harassment, or loss of political influence. The combination of a growing, restless youth population and an opposition that had become increasingly organized created pressure points that the government could not entirely ignore. The more Museveni relied on the security apparatus to suppress dissent, the more visible the divide between the state and ordinary citizens became. Alongside political tension, issues of governance continued to fuel public anger. Allegations of corruption within the government persisted, involving large-scale procurement contracts, mismanagement of public funds, and favoritism in awarding key projects. While the president's supporters argued that these were isolated incidents and that overall stability justified his leadership, critics insisted that decades of unchecked power had allowed patronage networks to flourish, leaving the majority of Ugandans without access to opportunities or fair treatment. This perception of inequality intensified feelings of frustration and fed into the narrative that Museveni had become increasingly self-serving rather than acting as a leader for all Ugandans. Another factor deepening public dissatisfaction was the continued militarization of politics. Museveni, whose rise to power had been built on the strength of the NRA, continued to rely heavily on the military and security services for political control. Elections, protests, and public gatherings were often closely monitored, sometimes violently disrupted, and at times shut down entirely. For many, this approach felt less like leadership and more like control, with state power used to limit citizen participation and maintain dominance. Images of heavily armed forces confronting unarmed protesters, videos of arrests at political rallies, and reports of intimidation created a stark visual record that many interpreted as evidence of authoritarianism. By the late 2010s and into the 2020s, Uganda had reached a crossroads. Museveni remained a figure of undeniable influence, holding power through elections, constitutional amendments, and widespread political networks. Yet public opinion was sharply divided. On one side were those who credited him with keeping Uganda stable, rebuilding infrastructure, and providing continuity in a region marked by conflict. On the other side were citizens increasingly frustrated by what they saw as decades of stagnation, inequality, repression, and unfulfilled promises. The combination of generational change, social media influence, and visible governance failures created a situation where anger and resentment toward Museveni became as widespread as admiration once had been, setting the stage for a new era of political contestation and societal debate. As Museveni continued his long tenure in power, his position on the international stage became a complex mix of respect, pragmatism, and criticism. For decades, he was seen by many foreign governments, particularly in the West, as a stabilizing force in East Africa. His early interventions in regional conflicts, support for peacekeeping missions, and willingness to collaborate on economic and security initiatives earned him praise from international leaders. Uganda under Museveni became a reliable partner in matters of regional security, counterterrorism, and refugee management, especially with large numbers of refugees fleeing conflicts in neighboring countries, such as South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. These actions helped cultivate an image of Museveni as a statesman capable of maintaining stability in a volatile region. At the same time, international observers and human rights organizations frequently criticized his domestic policies. Reports highlighted restrictions on political freedoms, harassment of opposition leaders, suppression of protests, and media censorship. The contrast between Uganda's outward image of stability and its internal struggles with political dissent created a complex narrative. On one hand, Museveni was hailed as a pragmatic leader who could negotiate peace and maintain order. On the other hand, his critics accused him of systematically consolidating power and undermining democratic institutions to remain in office indefinitely. This duality often baffled foreign analysts and led to a situation where international support coexisted with ongoing scrutiny of Uganda's governance. Museveni's relationship with Western donors and international financial institutions was particularly notable. Uganda received billions of dollars in aid and investment over the years, much of it justified by the government as necessary to rebuild infrastructure, improve healthcare, and develop education. However, critics argued that some of this aid was channeled towards strengthening Museveni's political networks and consolidating state power rather than reaching ordinary citizens. Reports of corruption and mismanagement raised questions about accountability and transparency. International agencies sometimes applied pressure for reforms, but Museveni's government often resisted measures that threatened his control, creating tension between Uganda's development goals and political realities. Regionally, Museveni was also a formidable figure. He played a significant role in mediating conflicts in countries like South Sudan, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, positioning himself as an indispensable regional leader. His influence in East African politics was undeniable. He was invited to peace talks, consulted by neighboring governments, and often portrayed as someone with the experience and authority to broker stability. Yet, domestically, this regional prominence was a double-edged sword. Many Ugandans grew frustrated as they observed their president spending significant resources and attention on foreign affairs while pressing domestic issues, such as corruption, youth unemployment, and limited political freedoms, remained unresolved. The contrast between Uganda's regional image and internal challenges became a source of growing dissatisfaction and intensified the perception that Museveni prioritized power over people. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, the international community had a nuanced view of Museveni. On one hand, he was respected as a seasoned leader with decades of experience in governance, diplomacy, and conflict resolution. On the other hand, persistent reports of political repression, election irregularities, and human rights violations painted a picture of a government increasingly resistant to reform. For many Ugandans, the contrast between Museveni's international stature and their daily experiences at home, where opportunities were limited and dissent was often met with force, fueled resentment. It was this growing divide between global perception and domestic reality that helped explain why so many citizens openly criticized him, accused him of being a dictator, or expressed outright anger at his prolonged grip on power. This section of Museveni's story highlights a central tension that has defined his long presidency. While he is widely respected abroad for his role in stabilizing Uganda and the region, at home, the cost of decades in power has created deep divisions, amplified youth frustration, and intensified calls for political change. It is this tension, the simultaneous praise and condemnation, that has come to define Museveni's complex legacy in the eyes of both Ugandans and the wider world. Looking back over nearly 4 decades of leadership, Yoweri Museveni's legacy in Uganda is one of profound complexity, marked by both significant achievements and deep controversies. On one hand, he transformed a country battered by years of coups, civil war, and political instability into a nation that, for much of his rule, experienced relative peace, infrastructure growth, and economic development. Roads were built, schools and hospitals reopened, and foreign investment brought new opportunities. In the eyes of many, particularly in rural areas and among older generations who remember the chaos of the 1970s and 1980s, Museveni is a hero, a stabilizer who prevented Uganda from sliding back into anarchy and who brought hope where there was despair. Yet, Alongside these achievements lies a pattern that has increasingly fueled frustration and resentment. Museveni's long tenure has been characterized by efforts to consolidate power, amend constitutions to remove age and term limits, and restrict political competition. Opposition figures have been frequently arrested, protests violently suppressed, and public dissent curtailed. Corruption and inequality have persisted, leading many citizens, especially the youth, to feel excluded from the economic and political benefits that growth has brought. For a generation that has grown up knowing only one president, the prolonged dominance of Museveni has created a sense of stagnation, a perception that the system is designed to maintain one individual's rule rather than serve the nation as a whole. These tensions are compounded by a stark generational and geographical divide. Older Ugandans and those in rural areas often still credit Museveni with stability and incremental development, while younger citizens and urban populations increasingly view him as an out-of-touch leader who suppresses opportunities for meaningful change. Social media has amplified this divide, providing a platform for voices of dissent, while also exposing Ugandans to global ideas about democracy, freedom, and youth empowerment. The rise of figures like Bobi Wine reflects this shift, as a new generation demands leadership that mirrors their experiences, priorities, and frustrations. Museveni's rule has also highlighted the duality of public perception. Internationally, he is often respected as a seasoned statesman who has played a key role in regional peacekeeping and diplomacy. Yet domestically, many see him as an authoritarian figure who has overstayed his welcome. This tension between global respect and local resentment underscores why debates about Museveni are so passionate and polarizing. His story is one of remarkable personal resilience and political skill, but it is equally a story of growing disillusionment and public anger among those who feel left behind or unheard. In the end, the question of why so many Ugandans criticize Museveni, or even label him a dictator, is deeply tied to the duration of his rule, the concentration of power, and the generational changes within the country. Museveni's rise from a revolutionary bushfighter to a long-serving president is a tale of courage, strategy, and determination. Yet it is also a cautionary story about the challenges of prolonged leadership, the dangers of political centralization, and the tension between stability and freedom. For some, he remains the liberator who restored order and hope. For others, he is the symbol of a government that resists change and limits the voices of its people. It is this duality, admiration intertwined with anger, that defines the enduring and complex legacy of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni in Uganda's history. And that wraps up our deep dive into the life and rule of Yoweri Museveni, Uganda's long-serving president. From his early days as a young revolutionary to the complex, often controversial figure he is today, Museveni's story is one of both admiration and criticism, hope and frustration. Whether you see him as a stabilizing force or as a leader who has overstayed his welcome, there's no denying his impact on Uganda's history. If you found this story insightful, thought-provoking, or even surprising, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a detailed story like this. Also, click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest videos covering history, politics, and fascinating world stories. We'd love to hear what you think. Do you agree with the criticisms, or do you believe Museveni has done more good than harm? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.